Injustice, prejudice, a fight for the truth in the face of overwhelming odds. What happens when the system designed to deliver justice becomes a weapon of oppression? Today, we unravel a story that's equal parts heartbreaking and inspiring, one that demands your attention. Let me ask you this. How far would you go to prove your innocence when everyone, even the system, is against you? Buckle up. This is the story of Simon, a black man in Florida wrongfully accused of a horrific crime. The sun rose over Florida like a promise, draping the modest neighborhood in a soft golden glow. Children played basketball in a driveway, their laughter mixing with the faint hum of a passing mail truck. Nearby, at a bustling construction site, the air was alive with the clamor of jackhammers and shouted commands, a chaos that, strangely, felt like home to Simon. Simon wasn't just another teenager clocking in and out of a part-time job. He was 19, balancing school, work, and dreams that felt both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close. How many 19-year-olds carried that kind of weight on their shoulders and still walked tall? The site was a mess of noise and movement, but Simon found peace in the rhythm of his tasks. Measuring a piece of steel with surgical precision, he tuned out the world around him, his mind 3 steps ahead of his hands. Why did he work so hard? Was it for the paycheck? To stay out of trouble? Or was it something deeper, something the world often overlooked in boys like Simon? His coworkers watched him with a mix of respect and curiosity. "That kid's got a future," one of them had said, shaking his head as Simon maneuvered a heavy beam into place with the ease of someone twice his age. But Simon wasn't just earning their respect. He was building something more, a foundation for a life that defied the odds. The walk home after a shift felt like a quiet victory lap. Boots slung over his shoulder, Simon greeted neighbors with a tired but genuine smile. His modest house stood at the end of the street, where dreams were like stars, visible, beautiful, but so often out of reach. Yet Simon dared to reach. At the kitchen table, he sketched designs on graph paper, his pencil flying over the grid like it had a mind of its own. Next to him sat a worn notebook filled with calculations and notes, a roadmap to the future he wanted so badly to build. Could he really become an engineer one day? Could the boy helping construct buildings now design them later? Simon thought so. He had to believe it. Because if he didn't, who would? But not everyone saw the promise Simon carried. To Clark Jones, Simon was an anomaly, a challenge to everything Clark thought he understood about power, privilege, and place. Clark arrived at the site in his father's shiny car, his sunglasses reflecting the sun, but failing to mask the sneer curling his lips. What was it about Simon that infuriated him so much? Was it his skill, his respect, his unshakable dignity? Or was it the fact that Simon didn't seem to need Clark's approval to succeed? Clark watched as Simon earned a rare nod of approval from the foreman, his envy morphing into something darker. It wasn't just envy, it was fury. To Clark, Simon's success was a threat, an affront to the unspoken rules Clark had always lived by. The bullying started small. A bottle cap thrown during lunch, snide comments whispered just loud enough for Simon to hear. Simon ignored it, his silence a shield Clark couldn't crack. But Clark wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily, especially when he felt his world slipping out of his control. And then there was Isabel Wells. Isabel, with her easy laugh and kind eyes, who had chosen Simon over everyone else. Over Clark. Did Clark hate Simon because of Isabel? Or had Isabel simply given Clark an excuse to unleash the hatred he already carried? In the park, Simon and Isabel sat on a bench, laughing softly as the sun dipped below the horizon. Across the way, Clark watched, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. To him, this was more than a slight, it was a betrayal. How could Isabel, the daughter of a prestigious judge, be with Simon? A black boy from a neighborhood Clark had only ever seen through the tinted windows of his car. To Clark, it was unthinkable and unforgivable. The construction site faded into the background, the hum of machinery giving way to a creeping tension. Simon didn't know it yet, but his world was about to change forever. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of who he was, and because some people, like Clark, couldn't stand to see him thrive. The Florida evening lingered in the air like the softest whisper, the last golden light of day filtering through the thick trees. A secluded forest road stretched out, quiet and untouched, a haven, a secret space that Simon and Isabel had claimed as their own. Amid all the noise, of all the weight Simon carried, this place felt like an escape, a brief breath of freedom. Hand in hand, they laughed, genuine, unburdened for a moment. Nothing else mattered. But in the silence of the forest, they were not alone. From a distance, hidden behind the shadows of thick bushes, Clark watched. His eyes, narrow and cold, were trained on them. The binoculars in his hands shook, trembling with rage. The sight of them together was too much to bear. Isabel, the girl he believed belonged to him, standing there with Simon, with him, it twisted something dark and bitter inside Clark. His jaw clenched. His breath grew shallow, his hatred simmering, boiling over. The jealousy coursing through him was suffocating, drowning out everything but the need to act. And act he did. Clark stormed toward them, his footsteps heavy, filled with an anger that rattled the very air. Simon and Isabel turned in unison, their smiles faltering as they saw him approaching. What was he doing here? What did he want? Clark didn't wait for answers. He unleashed the venom he'd been carrying, his words sharp and cruel. He spat accusations, calling Simon unworthy, a fraud, someone who didn't belong in Isabel's life. Simon, taken aback, tried to stay calm, tried to shield Isabel from the storm of rage Clark was throwing at him. Just leave, Isabel, Simon urged softly, but Clark wasn't done. No, this was about more than words. This was about control, about breaking Simon most painfully. Clark shoved Simon hard, sending him stumbling back. He turned then, grabbing Isabel by the arm and pulling her away from him. Simon, dazed but resolute, stepped forward, but Clark wasn't finished. In a sickening flash, Clark mocked Simon, taunted him, and then, the unthinkable. He urinated on Simon, his laughter cruel, the moment dripping with madness. The laughter hung in the air, bitter, acid, the humiliation unbearable. Isabel could take no more. Her love for Simon burned hot, her sense of dignity rising in revolt against Clark's madness. She pushed him, shouting at him to stop, but Clark's fury exploded in an instant. Without warning, he slapped Isabel across the face, hard, violent, sending her reeling backwards. And then, in one swift motion, he shoved her, hard. Isabel's body wavered, her arms flailing in the air as she tried to steady herself. But it was too late. The edge of the cliff, so close, so dangerously close, came rushing at her. Time seemed to slow as if the world itself had paused to hold its breath. She fell. Simon's heart stopped, his lungs froze. Isabel! His voice cracked the air, raw, desperate. He ran to the edge, his legs shaking, eyes wide with horror. The world was crumbling. Without thinking, without hesitation, Simon scrambled down the rocky incline, his hands gripping the jagged stones, his heart pounding in his chest. Every second was an eternity, each breath a struggle against the gravity of what was happening. Clark stood there, motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide. He knew what he had done. He couldn't take it back. But Simon didn't care. All he could see was Isabel, slipping further away with each heartbeat. And then there was Jonas. Jonas had arrived just in time to witness the entire horrific scene unfold. He stood frozen, watching, paralyzed by fear. Panic filled his eyes as he glanced from Simon to Clark, back to Simon again. His breath caught in his throat. He saw it all, the rage, the violence, the fall. But when Simon screamed at him, his voice hoarse with desperation, "Call 911, please," Jonas hesitated. Why? What held him back? Was it fear of Clark, fear of what would happen if he got involved? Or was it the suffocating weight of the Wells family's influence, the power that seemed to stretch over everything? For one terrible moment, Jonas didn't move. And then the sirens wailed in the distance, the sound of approaching police cutting through the stillness of the forest like a knife. But for Simon, for Isabel, for what had just happened, was it too late? Was it ever going to be enough? The night was heavy, suffocatingly so, as if the air itself carried the weight of what had just happened. The red and blue lights from the patrol car splashed against the trees, painting the scene in frantic flashes of urgency. The sirens wailed, then abruptly cut off, leaving only the hum of the car's engine and the distant rustling of leaves. The officers stepped out, their boots crunching against the dirt. Their faces were unreadable, but their postures screamed authority and suspicion. They scanned the scene, their eyes locking onto Clark, who was pacing erratically. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, but his voice was steady. too steady for someone supposedly stricken with grief. "He did it!" Clark pointed an accusatory finger at Simon, who knelt at the base of the cliff, his hands trembling as they cradled Isabel's lifeless body. His voice cracked as he whispered her name over and over, desperate for a response that would never come. Jonas stood off to the side, frozen, his eyes darting between Clark and Simon. He knew what had happened. He had seen the shove, the fall, the panic. But now, standing here under the scrutiny of the officers, his lips refused to move. Clark, emboldened by Jonas's silence, stepped forward. He attacked her. He was jealous, angry, and when she tried to get away, he pushed her. His voice rose with each word, a performance tailored to the audience he knew would believe him. The lead officer, Smith, turned to Simon, his eyes narrowing. There was no hesitation in his movements, no pause to consider the possibility that Clark's words might not be true. He didn't need to ask questions or gather evidence. To him, the sight of a young black boy holding the lifeless body of a white girl was evidence enough. "Drop her," Smith barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Simon looked up, his face streaked with tears, confusion and disbelief clouding his features. "Please, I didn't." "Drop her!" Smith's voice cut through the night like a blade. Simon gently lowered Isabel to the ground, his hands shaking as he raised them in surrender. But his compliance didn't matter. Smith lunged forward, grabbing Simon roughly by the arm and twisting it behind his back. "You're under arrest for murder," Smith growled, shoving Simon forward. "No, please, you don't understand," Simon pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. But Smith wasn't listening. He was already dragging Simon toward the patrol car, the cuffs biting into his wrists. Behind them, the second officer approached Clark and Jonas. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone softer but no less suspicious. Clark didn't miss a beat. "We were walking, and we saw him. He attacked her. He was out of control." His voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. Jonas opened his mouth, the truth clawing at his throat, but Clark shot him a warning glance, a reminder of the consequences that would follow if he dared to speak against him. Jonas looked down, nodding mutely. Smith shoved Simon into the back of the patrol car, slamming the door shut with a finality that felt like a verdict. Simon's face pressed against the cold glass, his eyes wide with shock and despair. He could still see Isabel lying at the base of the cliff, her golden hair catching the moonlight, a stark contrast to the blood staining her dress. At the station, the contrast was glaring. Clark and Jonas sat in a brightly lit room, steaming cups of coffee in front of them, while Simon was thrown into a cold, damp cell. His hands, still stained with Isabel's blood, trembled as he held his head in his hands. Clark's lies grew bolder as he recounted the fabricated story to the officers. He was obsessed with her. She tried to get away, and he just snapped. "It was terrifying," he said, his voice steady, his expression one of practiced grief. Jonas sat silently, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He couldn't meet Simon's eyes through the bars of the cell. For the officers, the case was open and shut. A white girl was dead, and a black boy was the only suspect they needed. Isabel's family arrived soon after, their grief fueling their demands for justice. "Make sure he never sees the light of day," Judge Wells spat, his voice filled with venom. Simon sat in the shadows of his cell, his mind racing. He had done everything he could to save Isabel, and now he was being blamed for her death. His heart ached for her, for the love they had shared, and for the life that was stolen from both of them. But more than anything, he ached for the truth that no one seemed willing to see. At that moment, Simon wasn't just a boy who had lost the girl he loved. He became a symbol, a scapegoat in a system that had already decided he was guilty the moment they saw his skin. The holding cell felt smaller with each passing minute. The harsh fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of Simon's isolation. He sat against the cold stone wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his mind swirling in disbelief. How had everything spiraled so far, so quickly? He could still hear the sound of Isabel's voice in his mind, her laughter, her warmth. It felt like a lifetime ago. Out there, in the world beyond those bars, Clark and Jonas were comforted by their families, reassured that they were safe, that the system would work in their favor. In the sterile halls of the police station, their parents, cloaked in wealth and influence, made sure that everything would be handled. Simon, on the other hand, was alone. He had no family to protect him, no powerful connections to pull strings on his behalf. The only person who seemed to care, who seemed to see the truth of his innocence, was Mrs. Baker's, his mother's best friend. She had always been there for him, even after his mother's passing. When Mrs. Baker's arrived at the station, her face drawn but determined, she was a beacon of hope in a place that seemed determined to destroy him. She had already hired a lawyer, a man who seemed too calm, too collected in the face of everything Simon was facing. "We'll fight this," Mrs. Bakers told Simon in a quiet voice, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. But even she knew that the fight ahead would be long, exhausting, and full of obstacles. The odds were stacked against them. The power of Clark's family, the Wells family, would make sure that Simon stayed in prison. Judge Wells, Isabel's father, was already making it clear that he would not rest until Simon was locked away forever. His voice carried an unmistakable venom as he spoke about Simon's guilt, his grief clouding any attempt at reason. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was thick with tension. It was a place where emotions were tightly wound, and the air seemed to hum with unspoken judgments. Simon sat at the defense table, his face a mask of exhaustion, his eyes heavy with the weight of his ordeal. The room was filled with the hum of hushed conversations, the sound of people shifting in their seats, all eyes on him. He could feel the weight of the jury's gaze upon him, judgment already written on their faces. They hadn't heard his side of the story. They hadn't seen what he had seen. And yet, Simon knew that the color of his skin had already placed him on trial before a single word had been spoken. His lawyer, a seasoned professional who had seen many trials, sat beside him, flipping through pages of evidence. Across the room, Clark sat arrogantly, his arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across his face. The Wells family's influence hung over the proceedings like a dark cloud. The wealthy elite, determined to protect their own, had already begun weaving a web of lies to entrap Simon. Every move seemed calculated. Every word from Clark's side of the room seemed designed to manipulate the truth. The trial had been rigged from the start. It was as if Simon had never stood a chance. The Wells family, with their far-reaching power, had made sure that no one would come forward to testify on Simon's behalf. Clark's father used his wealth and influence to silence potential witnesses, making it nearly impossible for Simon to find the support he needed. Simon's co-workers, who knew about Clark's hostility, who could speak to the tension that had been brewing between the two men, were conspicuously absent from the stand. Their silence spoke volumes, and Simon knew all too well who had orchestrated their absence. Even Jonas, the one person who could have testified to the truth, had chosen to remain silent, perhaps out of fear or self-preservation. His silence felt like a betrayal, leaving Simon to face the wrath of the powerful alone. As the trial dragged on, Simon's hope began to dwindle. It felt like the truth was slipping further and further from his grasp. But then, there was a moment, a flicker of possibility. It was time for Clark to speak. Clark sat at the witness stand, a smug smile playing on his lips. He was calm, too calm, as he recounted the night of the incident. His version of events was a twisted web of lies, each word carefully chosen to paint Simon as a monster. He accused Simon of attacking Isabel in a fit of rage, of pushing her over the edge of the cliff, and of suffocating her to make sure she wouldn't survive. His voice was smooth, convincing, and it was clear that the jury was listening, hanging on his every word. Jonas, seated nervously beside Clark, shifted in his chair. His eyes flicked back and forth between Simon and the lawyer questioning him. Jonas was cracking. The cracks in Clark's story were beginning to show, but Jonas's fear kept him quiet. He said just enough to keep the lie intact, but the doubt was creeping in. Then came the pivotal moment. The defense lawyer stood, walking slowly toward Jonas, his gaze steady, unrelenting. He knew this was his chance. "Jonas," the lawyer began, his voice calm but firm, "you saw what happened that night. You were there. Tell us, Jonas, did you see Simon push Isabel?" Jonas hesitated. His lips trembled, his hands clenched into fists, but the pressure was too much. Slowly, he began to falter. His voice wavered, and the cracks in the story deepened. He began to doubt the narrative he had been forced to accept. Then, as if by some miracle, the video surfaced. a recording from a nearby security camera. The footage, clear and undeniable, captured the truth. It showed Clark's violent outburst, his push, and Isabel's fall. Simon had tried to save her, his frantic movements proving that he hadn't been the one to cause her death. The video, raw and honest, changed everything. In that moment, the room fell silent. The truth could no longer be denied. Clark's lies crumbled, and Simon, though still shattered by the events of that night, felt a glimmer of hope. The truth had finally come to light. But the moment the footage was shown, the room seemed to shift. Clark's lawyer, ever the manipulator, twisted the narrative stating the fall could not have led of Isabel's death. He claimed that Simon had suffocated Isabel when he went down the cliff after her fall, as though somehow Simon's grief and panic had turned into something far darker. The judge, a man who had shown a clear bias from the very beginning, dismissed the footage as inconclusive. It was a gut-wrenching moment, one that seemed to twist Simon's insides. How could the truth be so easily ignored? How could the judge, standing in the place of justice, be so blind? The injustice of it all was suffocating. In the midst of it all, Simon's mother's friend, Mrs. Bakers, sat in the courtroom. Her hands were clasped tightly in prayer, her face drawn with worry. She had been there from the beginning, her unwavering support a beacon in the darkness. She believed in Simon's innocence, even when the world seemed intent on crushing him. Her faith in him never wavered, and as she prayed, it was clear that she wasn't just praying for a verdict. She was praying for a miracle. And then, when all seemed lost, the miracle arrived. A local photographer, someone completely unrelated to the case, stepped into the courtroom. He was holding an envelope in his hand, his face nervous yet determined. He explained that he had been in the area that day, taking landscape photographs of the cliffs. He had no idea that he had inadvertently captured the entire incident on camera. His photos, clear and vivid, showed Clark's violent push, Isabel's fall, and Simon's frantic attempts to reach her. The images, unfiltered and uncensored, were irrefutable. They told the truth in a way that words never could. As the photographs were presented to the court, the tension shifted. The room grew still, as if time had momentarily stopped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the truth had a chance to breathe. The lies that had been woven so carefully began to unravel, and for a moment, it felt like justice might finally prevail. The photographer's testimony wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was the turning point in Simon's fight for justice. The photos were clear evidence of what had truly happened, and they exposed Clark's role in the tragic events. It wasn't just a victory for Simon. It was a victory for truth, for those who had fought against the tide of lies, for the people who had believed in him when the world had turned its back. The room buzzed with whispers, and Clark's smug grin began to fade. His carefully crafted story was beginning to crumble. And Simon, though still weary and battered by the journey, felt a glimmer of hope. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where the truth could finally shine through, where justice could be served. Justice. For so long, it had seemed an unreachable ideal for Simon. He had endured so much, trapped in a web of lies, facing the relentless weight of a system that saw only the color of his skin, not the truth of his heart. But then, in the quiet moments after everything had seemed lost, something remarkable happened.